Hi everyone, thank you for being here. When you're a child who's experienced something traumatic, confusing, or just not really acknowledged, you learn to survive in whatever ways you can. You adapt and you become who the world and the people around you seem to need you to be. For many adopted people, these strategies become automatic and invisible, even to ourselves. We adopted people just knew that we needed to stay safe, to belong, and to be kept. Because the world around us, it often misread everything that it saw. And so today, I just want to run through and explore a few of the coping strategies that shaped us and how they were misunderstood and why every single one of them made complete sense. In Survival 101, which is a chapter in my book, I describe the two main adaptations. Now, this is obviously a shortened version. There are multiple adaptations that we display and exhibit as adopted people. But the two main adaptations, certainly that show up in children and young adults, are what I'm going to talk about now. But I do want to say that we don't tend to, many of us don't just sort of exhibit certain behaviours and then stick to them. We kind of move between the two. But the first one that I want to talk about is compliance. Many of us became easy, quiet, hyper attuned to what others seem to need. We monitored ourselves constantly and we learned to sort of smooth over emotional situations. Essentially, we avoided being too much, in inverted commas. We tried to make belonging something that we could earn through, compliance, good behaviour. The second path looks different and comes from the same place, essentially, what some might call rebellion or acting out. Because when disappearing sort of felt unbearable or we felt pushed back, we acted out feelings that we didn't have words for. We tested whether love could survive conflict. We refused to fade into the background. Both strategies, compliance and rebellion, or what has been called internalizing and externalizing, were basically communicating the same thing, which is I don't know how to ask for what I need. And as I explained previously, these responses are not personality flaws or signs of subdued or complicated children. They're just natural human reactions to early separation and uncertainty. So research does show how adopted people often develop heightened sensitivity to others' emotions, and many do display externalizing behaviors in adolescence. So you might find a very, very quiet, compliant younger child who kind of flips over into externalizing behaviors in adolescence. And that may not just show as just being kind of shouty and loud and naughty. It can come out in other ways, such as risk-taking behaviors and other ways that aren't always appreciated by other people, maybe in the family or in society more generally. But the point of it is none of it's random and all of it tracks back to what came before language. In the chapter Beneath the Surface, I explore how these survival strategies were so often misunderstood and worse, pathologized. For those of us who were quiet and compliant, very often our adopted parents believed everything was fine, that we were good children, and silence protected them from confronting the harder parts of our story. Our pain stayed invisible, and sometimes even to us. And those who coped through outward expression, the reactions were judged rather than understood. What looked like defiance was very often fear, and what might have been labelled avoidant or oppositional was actually an overwhelmed child or young person trying to communicate in the only way they knew how. Many people, very sadly, spent years in therapy without adoption ever being mentioned. Others tried to explain what it feels like to grow up, only to be told it shouldn't matter, or that love, if it was there, should have been enough. But the point here is that when the core of your story is invisible to others, you can begin to feel invisible to yourself. I talk about guilt versus shame. Guilt is the thing that says, I did something wrong, or alternatively, I didn't do something, maybe I should have. Whereas shame says, I am something wrong. For adopted people, we carry so much guilt, and it's far more complex than simply feeling responsible or irresponsible. It often begins long before we have the language. Yeah, many of us don't understand why we feel guilty, only that we do. And some of this comes from loyalty, yes, or feeling that we're not being loyal or we're being disloyal in some way, just through our feelings alone. But also, much of it does come from fear, and that's a fear that was there really from the very first separation, pre-verbally, and that can be fear of losing belonging, fear of upsetting the fragile balance of our families, fear of being too much, or fear of being too honest, and fear that our needs might cost us some connection. And because this guilt begins so early, it doesn't feel like a thought, it feels like a truth. And it can show up in so many ways, physical ways, in our bodies, a tightening in the chest, or for many, sort of a sense of heaviness in the stomach, a feeling that we shouldn't ask, shouldn't question, or shouldn't disrupt anything. It can become a way of keeping ourselves safe in relationships that may feel emotionally delicate, even when no one intends them to be. When we grow up and start searching, questioning, or struggling, that pre-verbal guilt can rise up as if we're doing something wrong, even though we're not. But shame goes deeper. In the Weight We Carry chapter in my book, I explore how adopted people internalize the beliefs that we're not enough to keep, that we were not enough to keep, even when we intellectually understand our biological parents or our biological mother's decision, or joint decision in some cases. Shame whispers that if we'd been different, better, the outcome might have changed. And so together, this early guilt and the early shame becomes the lens through which we interpret our later struggles and value, often without realizing it. I do push this point quite a lot because I think it's so important, because so many of us struggle with all of this. What I want to say very clearly is that our responses were perfectly normal responses to a difficult situation. You know, the compliance that made us invisible, it was an adaptation to an environment that couldn't hold our full emotional reality. The rebellion or behaviours that got us labelled as difficult or worse, that was a communication, an attempt to bring our inner world into the room. And the guilt, you know, that was protection, an early embodied attempt to keep connection intact. The shame, which is the heaviest of all, was the sense that there's something wrong with us or that we're deeply flawed at some point. That's never ours. We should never have experienced that. That shame belongs to systems that have minimized our early losses and to narratives that haven't been able to hold the complexity of our situations, our adoptions. And so these strategies have helped us to survive. But survival strategies don't simply fade, they shape adulthood, they shape our relationships, our self worth, our identities, and they're part of why adopted people are so overrepresented in therapy. And again, not because we're broken or flawed, but because our beginnings mattered more than anyone allowed us to acknowledge. But, with reflection, understanding, and acceptance, not judgment, we can now ask, do these strategies still serve me? Or am I still trying to earn something that should never have been conditional? On that point, acceptance, safety, and belonging, these aren't rewards, they're basic human needs. So if you never felt fully safe to claim them, then of course it makes complete sense that you found your own ways to try. And so now, with understanding and gentleness and openness with yourself, you get to decide what stays and what you're ready to release. We're survivors and we got through it, and that's everything. It wasn't easy, but things can change, but we have to look at our story with a different lens, I think, in order for that to happen. So understand then that our coping strategies were intelligent responses, not flaws, that being misunderstood added layers to the original loss. Guilt and shame are different, and neither belong to us really in the first place. Our survival patterns made total sense. And when you look at all of this and understand it differently and can be more compassionate with yourself, they can be gently changed. My book, Adopted and Seen, is designed to give you that space to understand your story in a clearer, more honest way. The journaling sections will help you to connect the dots between what you've experienced, how you adapted, and how those patterns still show up today. You're just being invited to notice what's true for you and give your feelings and thoughts a place to land, and very often for the first time, because it's about recognizing yourself in the first instance with context, understanding, and compassion. The link, if you're interested in delving deeper, is in the description. And as always, thank you very much for your time today. With love.